Camera basics, what you need to start doing now with the camera you already have to start getting a lot better pictures. Before I get too far into this video, make sure to click that subscribe button. Lets me know you guys want to see these videos, and if you're subscribed, you'll get to see more of me. Who wouldn't want that? There's three main things I'm going to cover today, three main settings you're going to want to know about and you're going to want to understand in order to start getting better pictures today. The first one is going to be shutter speed, second one is going to be aperture, and the third one is going to be ISO. Now, if you haven't heard of these, this will be a perfect video. I'm going to try and give you really basic beginner definitions and how to understand them and some practical ways you can start using them now without having too much knowledge for them. The first setting I want to talk about is shutter speed. Now, if you haven't heard of shutter speed before, like I said before, this will be the perfect video for you. I'm going to try and give a really basic definition and understanding so you know what it is and how to utilize it in your photos. Now, shutter speed essentially is how fast you take a picture. Now, the faster you take a picture, the less light you're gonna let in. On the opposite side, the slower you take a picture, the more light you're gonna let in. And there's a lot of ways that this can be helpful and detrimental in your photography. If you don't understand it correctly, it can definitely hurt you, but using it correctly, you can get way different photos and you can be way more creative with your photography. Let's take, for example, if you're taking photos at a sporting event or of an animal running or something like that, you're going to want a high shutter speed. You're taking the picture faster, therefore you want to stop the motion even faster. So if you saw a fox running, let's say, you would rather use 1/4000th of a second because that's faster than you'd want to use 1/2 of a second. If you use 1/4000th of a second, you're going to take that picture a lot quicker, whereas if you took it at 1/2 of a second, the shutter is going to close less fast and the picture is not going to be as sharp. That's a very important thing to keep in mind, and it's a very important component of shutter speed, is that it's really going to allow and determine how sharp your picture is and how much light you let in. Now, all three settings have to do with light and sharpness, but in shutter speed, the higher it is, the sharper the picture and the less light, and the lower the shutter speed, the slower it takes a picture and the brighter the pictures will turn out. A generic rule that I've come to know and that I use typically still is when I'm taking a portrait picture, I usually set it to at least 1/125th of a second. That's going to be a very good baseline for you to start off with if you've never used it before. Essentially doing 1/125th of a second is going to allow you to capture those basic human motions. Anything where a person slightly moves, or if you're holding a camera and you're shaking just a little bit or you move a little bit, it's going to compensate for those, so you're going to be able to get a sharper picture right away. The next thing we're talking about is aperture. It's a little bit more confusing than shutter speed, but it's still not very difficult to understand. In the end, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how all three of these settings play together and how you can use them to get the pictures you want. Aperture essentially is how open or closed you're taking that picture. Now, as a really good example, if you see a lens like this, you can adjust it so that would be a closed aperture and that would be a more wide open aperture. Essentially, the more open that aperture is, the more light you're letting in. So that's going to allow a lot more light to come in, opposed to if you had a smaller aperture that's very small, that's not going to let as much light into the photo. On the same topic as that, when you have a wide open aperture, that's going to allow for more bokeh. Quick understanding of what bokeh is, basically, in the very basic terms, bokeh is that blur you see in the background or the foreground of a photo, the areas that aren't in focus. So, you ever see those pictures that people take, portraits or anything like that, where the background has lights in it that are blown up and they're really blurry and smooth? That's bokeh. Anyway, the more open you have your aperture, the more bokeh you're going to be able to get. And vice versa, the more closed you have your aperture, the less bokeh you're going to get, because more of the photo will be in focus. Now, how does shutter speed and aperture work together? Well, it depends on what you're taking a picture of. Let's say you're taking a picture of something moving really fast, or you're at a sporting event, or there's an animal running. You're going to want to prioritize your shutter speed just a little bit more than your aperture, most likely. Therefore, you're going to want to start by adjusting your shutter speed to try and capture it as sharp as possible. And then from there, you'll move to your aperture and adjust that. For example, let's say you have somebody running really fast and it's starting to get a little dark outside. You're going to want to increase that shutter speed to, let's just say, 1/2000th of a second. Could be way different, but for example, we're going to use that. Once you increase it to 1/2000th of a second, if it's already kind of dark outside, your picture's going to turn out really dark because of that. So let's compensate with our aperture first. If that object's moving really fast, we can bring that aperture down and open it up even more. A very open aperture would be a low number, opposed to a closed aperture would be a higher number. So f2 would be more open than f16. On the same note, f2 would let in more light than f16, and f2 would have more bokeh than f16. Keeping that in mind, we have 1/2000th of a second shutter speed. We're going to bring that aperture down quite a bit in order to try and let in more light before we move on to the third setting, ISO. ISO is the very last setting that I'm going to talk about in this video. I'm going to try and keep this as basic as possible for a very simple understanding, especially with beginner knowledge. So ISO is your sensor sensitivity to light. Now that probably doesn't help you understand about light or what it has to do with it, how you'd adjust that with aperture and shutter speed. So I'm going to try and keep it even more simple. So essentially ISO, the lower the number, the darker, the higher the number, the brighter. Now why that's well and dandy, you don't want to get too high of an ISO. The higher you go, the more noise you're letting into that picture. I'm going to give a quick example so you understand what I mean by noise if you've never seen it, or if you don't understand if you've seen it or not. Right here is a photo that I took with ISO 100. As you can see, it's a nice picture, nice, crisp, and clean. Now we're going to swap it out with this one where I used a very high ISO. As you can see in this photo, there's a lot of grain and a lot of noise going on in that photo, so it doesn't look as sharp or as clean. Now if you're going for that old film kind of grainy look, it might not be the biggest deal to you. You might like the look. It adds in almost an artificial grain to your photo. Now if you're trying to do landscape shots, you're going to want to try and keep that at 100, which is your base ISO, and adjust your shutter speed and your aperture first, and then use that as your last case scenario if you need to add more light into the photo. Another quick point that I want to add in there, even after you adjust those three settings, if the photo is still a little dark, but you can kind of see those details in the shadows, that's perfectly fine. When you go into post-editing, every single time, hands down, I would rather have a dark picture than too bright of a picture. When the picture's a little too dark, and those shadows that are dark, you can usually bring back a lot of that detail, but when the picture's overexposed and way too bright, it's very difficult to get those highlights back and to show off some of those brighter spots in the picture. So 10 out of 10 times I would always recommend taking the picture darker than you need to. Oh yeah, another quick detail setting that you should change, that you need to change if you're trying to get serious in photography. Go into your camera settings, find out where it says image quality. Next to it you'll probably see JPEG if you haven't changed this setting already. Change that right now. Change that to RAW. That's going to allow more pixels, it's going to allow you to do a lot more editing in post. It's just going to allow your pictures to be that much better. Please, for the love of God, change that from JPEG to RAW right now. As a quick summary, adjust your shutter speed and your aperture first, and use the ISO last as a last resort to add more light into the photo. Try not to crank the ISO up too high or you'll start to see that grain in your photos. If you're taking a photo of something moving quickly, make sure to increase that shutter speed if you want to get it sharp. If you're trying to get more bokeh in a photo, make sure to prioritize that aperture and bring it down. That way your depth of field is more shallow and you can get more bokeh in the photo. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that was helpful. If not, feel free to reach out to me, let me know. I'm happy to answer any and all questions. Have a good one.